Aphoristic appendage to On Truthtelling. 401 to 450. 401. The pedagogical and the propagandistic are surely combined in the political arena. Much of what goes down there as thought is more like hitting on the same nail. However, it would be wrong to think this constant repetition has no design or purpose. Rather, it is meant to teach a certain way of thinking to a specific audience or, better, teach the language of this way of thinking, that is, all its idioms, arguments, and so on, so that one ends up with something that, surprise, barely requires thinking. 402. What is science? Essentially a body of interlocking and non-interlocking ideas based on and elevated by a rigorous, massive, and ongoing attempt to understand the nature of things. Or, to say it with less formality and a bit facetiously, science is glorified opinion. 403. Don't place too much faith in the public. The people who show up to see a prince crowned will also show up to see him beheaded. 404. Human beings are so exceedingly social that they have imagined obligations, appointments, and even retirement plans after death. 405. We are thrown into the world before we know it. Living a life is the long reorientation process taking us from being nothing to being somebody with a distinct destiny. 406. Thinking the worst of others is not unrelated to thinking the best of ourselves. 407. Who hasn't seen it? The ferocious animal that catches another by the throat. And we. 408. Make no mistake about it. However great and good a person may be, there will always be some who, for reasons as diverse as their political ends or personal demons, will drag him into the mud. 409. On the one side there is what could be called the country taste for a culture of familiarity and homogeneity. On the other side there is what could be called the city taste for a culture of difference and diversity. These opposing features, which are to be found in virtually every society, are at the roots of the monstrous struggle currently tearing apart Western civilization. In other words, although this struggle is morally and politically charged to the hilt, although it involves people calling each other the most horrid names, it is fundamentally a difference in orientation, preference, habit, and a conditioned way of being. 410. Until the day we've learned to start the conversation about our adversaries in a way different from what's the norm today, we won't be able to say there's been even a jot of progress in this area. 411. When there's a scandal, the steamroller of public opinion can be so frightening that even those only remotely connected to it take active measures to prove there's no connection between them and it. 412. The ego can be destructive just as a river that overflows its banks. But the first can no more be separated from society's most vital interests than the second from the earth's most fertile regions. 413. To look at a fish in an aquarium and think, yes, at a very early point in my development as a human being, I wasn't much different from it. 414. If a brain such as Darwin's can produce the theory of evolution and Einstein's the theory of relativity, then why not imagine every brain, though its owner be consigned to oblivion, making its contribution to the great river of human development and or the great ocean of human awareness? 415. If there's any saying that might be called hackneyed yet keeps its freshness over time, it must be, politics makes strange bedfellows, simply for the reason that the bedfellows really do turn out to be strange. 416. Anything scandalous in the camp of the adversary is blood in the water for those who wish to see it in disarray. 417. As everyday spectators of events at the local, national, and international level, we are often glued to things that, if they happened to us, would unglue us completely. 418. Irony of ironies. It could very well be that the most subtle avant-garde thought, once popularized, becomes more dogmatic, emotional, and anti-intellectual than the thought to which it opposes itself. 419. The newspaper has a vested interest in detecting and reporting on wrongdoing that, being profit-oriented, doesn't prevent it from doing its own kind of mischief. 420. Every time the same facts are interpreted in a different way, a slight alteration occurs in the depiction of the world. This is a subtle or not so subtle process that goes on indefinitely and that, at any particular time, allows for a number of ways to determine reality. You ask if there are alternative worlds. Be assured there are, and they're not so very far. 421. We cannot live without the notions of good and evil, but nobody has ever proven that this opposition exists sub specie aeternitatis despite an immense effort throughout history to think, imagine, believe, and claim otherwise. 422. The two great poles of attraction in human affairs are change and permanence. In some instances, it's the first that dominates, in others it's the second. Perhaps the most extensive representatives of these two poles in human thought are science, including technology, and religion, including diverse forms of metaphysical belief. But the first is no more absolute than the second since it always depends on fixed units and parts, and the second no more absolute than the first since it can always die out and be replaced. 423. Today, as always, there is this practice of wielding words as weapons with the violence and brutality that doing it in the name of good seems to license. 424. One measure of a happy life might be managing to get through it without being resentful over the worst. 425. In politics, hypocrisy is blatant but more accepted than outrage against it would ever indicate. 426. In the court of public opinion, the general rule is, in case no one has noticed, guilty until proven innocent. 427. A. I'm addicted to the news. B. But you're always complaining about it. A. I must be addicted to my complaining then. 428. A change of interests, tastes, predilections, objectives, and even ideas, how much of this is to fill a void that wasn't there when we were younger? 429. It's quite possible that all warfare would cease, and universal peace prevail if one day we were offered incontrovertible proof that the end of the world was nigh. 430. Let us imagine a person perfect in every way. And then let us imagine this same person falling off from perfection and developing some minor defect. Rest assured there would be at least one other person who, noticing this minor defect and with malice in his heart, would treat it as if it were the mark of Cain. 431. Perhaps the most common vice in politics is the practice of trying to make the other side look as if it were always in the wrong. 432. Just as truth is the first casualty of war, so is it the perennial one in the political arena. 433. A. I love my hate because it boils me up and gives me one of those moments of peak intensity that makes me feel truly alive. B. That certainly is a frank admission of why you hate. A. And it's so complicated. I even hate those who hate for the same reason. B. But that smacks of hypocrisy, don't you think? A. Who cares? Does an addict scruple about such matters? Just give me another fix. 434. In geopolitics so much is theater that it's safe to say the real play is off stage. 435. After arriving at some goal or advanced stage in life, we usually don't find it too difficult to forget all the messiness that was part of our getting there. 436. Sexually charged incidents or situations are common enough and may be criminal or criminalized for reasons as diverse as the ways in which both primal behavior and primary codes of conduct manifest themselves. 437. When it comes to thinking, believing, and expressing ourselves on a host of matters, we all live in a bubble that might be best called the now. 438. All his life he was a smart operator, and he got away with a lot. But then he was finally caught. And yet he still tried to be a smart operator, believe it or not, for that's all he was ever taught. 439. Here is someone who wants to be moral to the core. He seems to be a saint. Here is another who wants to know morality to the core. He seems to be both divine and demonic. He wants to know truth, but at what cost? 440. When a new moral outlook moves beyond intellectual circles and finds adherents at a more popular level, it's not long before the whole of society is affected. But what is indispensable as part of this process is that an increasing number of leaders, celebrities, and opinion makers add their voice to the proceedings. How much of this is sincere and how much is self-serving or a form of self-protection is one of those discomforting questions that tends to be raised only privately. 441. Being successful in politics at the highest level means giving the impression that one is playing the game of good versus evil while playing one's game beyond good and evil. 442. The best that we can do with all our laws is limit the worst. As for getting rid of it, a way has yet to be discovered. 443. Think of it. Only a few hundred years ago it was possible to be burnt at the stake for speaking against the church. To be sure, corruption was rampant in a monetary or material sense, but how this pales in comparison with the spiritual corruption which saw it become the tool of the Prince of Darkness and traitor to the Prince of Peace. 444. The moral sensibilities of an age are the boggy ground on which many are caught, some innocent and some not. 445. The moral sensibilities of an age are like a great net that sometimes captures more than it should but is seldom prosecuted for overfishing. 446. If there is a tendency in society to rank offenses in terms of their gravity, or even their depravity, until this peaks somewhere in the area of greatest moral sensibility, there is also a counter-tendency that plays down differences and degrees of severity in this selfsame area. 447. There are some words used in public and repeated on a regular basis that are clearly intended to make one feel more than to make one think. Perhaps this is not so bad in and of itself, for feelings do have a great deal of raw power. On the other hand, if ever there was a double-edged sword capable of doing both good and evil, this must be it. 448. Being a genius usually means being worse than a lot of people at a good many things but incomparably better at one. 449. The dream of one day being in the spotlight and the nightmare of one day being caught in a searchlight, have ever these two poles of human desire and destiny been closer than they are today? 450. Never has violent imagery been so common and widespread, so socially acceptable, one might say, as it is today. And never have acts of random violence been so common and widespread despite our outrage and repeated outcries against them. Would it not be inappropriate to suggest that there is some inconsistency here?